Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Alex Williamson and welcome to Fishtory. We are on episode 102 or so, and I hope you guys are having a good week. So, we're going to start off with a really cool story that highlights why animals sometimes can be used in really unexpected and creative ways, and why it's so important that animals that we may not think are useful for one reason or another are kept intact in our ecosystems. Not only for the reason that, they're part of the food web and they keep things alive and other things eat them, and even if mosquitoes are annoying, they're a part of the food cycle and things like that. Well, even bigger animals, like for instance sea turtles, are really important, and not just for all the ecological reasons that you would think that they're important, but for interesting creative reasons that scientists have been using them for the last several years. So this article was brought to my attention by a good friend of the channel and a friend of many of yours, Patrick. And Patrick said that, he sent me this article and said, you got to check this out. So it is reported that out of India and basically the Indian Ocean, so all of the Indian Ocean, all the way from Madagascar to India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, the Andaman Islands, anywhere really out there in that huge ocean between Australia and Madagascar. This is important, and it is talking about cyclones. So we know that typhoons come in and cyclones come in. Typhoons are generally in the Pacific, moving inwards towards Asia. Cyclones are usually coming in south of Taiwan, forming in that Indian Ocean area, and then either coming into India or Africa. And the problem is that with hurricanes, which are the exact same thing happening off the coast of Africa, off like Cote d'Ivoire and West Africa, then they work their way across the ocean and swoop down and then come into the Gulf of Mexico, northern South America, and the Bahamas. And here we have the money, the research, the funds, the drones. We actually have planes that fly into the center of the hurricanes and bring back data. They also have hundreds and hundreds of buoys that are out in the ocean, and they measure the salinity of the water, the temperature of the water, the currents, how fast the water's moving, and all these sort of things. And we build a really good picture on when they're going to make landfall. Now, even with all that data, you guys probably think, yeah, right, they sure know when where they're going to hit, sure. And it may seem like it's chaotic, but when they can give you a cone of certainty or uncertainty, and it's even a few 100 miles, at least then you know to be ready, that it could be coming your way, or it could hook around a certain way, or whatever it may be. Governments can get resources in place. Well, that's not true for down in the Indian Ocean. There's no buoys out there to speak of for this purpose. There are buoys owned by certain countries that they monitor for their own uses for certain things pretty close to the shore, but there's not much down in the deep open ocean. And so they needed to figure out something to get data from that area. So they tried floating things across, a message in a bottle, essentially. And it gets stuck in this current called the doldrums, and it just kind of floats there in circles at a certain latitude, and it's dangerously close to that. They also call them sometimes the horse latitudes, which is because they got so desperate on sailing ships that that's when they would have to slaughter the horses and eat that meat and eat like their boots and leather and things like that. Like that was the starvation latitudes where they could get caught without wind at all. And it's within those latitudes that it's really hard to get data from unless you have a stationary boat or you've got a buoy or an island out there that can feed data back. And then let alone measuring the temperature of the water at real time, sending info back, has been really hard. So what they decided to do, after a lot of biologists put their head together with some meteorologists, is they tried different animals, and it ended up with the loggerhead turtle and the Ridley sea turtle, that they figured out that they could actually put this little quarter-kilo weight sensor on them that would test salinity. It would test the temperature at like intervals of every couple minutes, and it would give them GPS data of where they were in the water. Now, they could have beacons that actually send back info to satellites, but they would need to be charged somehow or have a battery that lasts for like 6 months. And so those beacons are like 5 or 6 pounds and still too big for the turtles. They get in the way. So what's cool about turtles is that they come back to their nesting grounds. So the scientists won't necessarily have real data in time this year, but they'll have all of last year's data finally, which they're kind of missing, because the other problem is that that area is covered in cloud cover, and satellites can't read the temperature of the ocean surface. And the temperature of the top 200 feet or so of water, and specifically really the top 10 feet of water, are the most important for measuring how strong hurricanes are going to be. And if they can map that out better, they can map out the path of these hurricanes, and they can use the few buoys in those few countries like Australia or the Andaman Islands in India. Madagascar doesn't have much, but there are some other French assets and things off the Seychelles Islands. And so they can use some of those things for active time data and shipping information relayed in from cargo ships and so forth, and hopefully get a better picture of kind of filling in the blanks. And that's exactly what they're being able to do. And they're being able to predict this with way better certainty than they were able to even before 2019. Because that's the year they first tried it out. And they tried strapping these to penguins. They tried other animals. But they either, on whales and things like that, they either would go too deep, or they'd shake them off, they'd rub against something, or they would be too high in the water and not get the sensor info. And those turtles hang out at exactly the right depth. They're usually hanging out around 10 feet, cruising if they're traveling, and then for feeding they go about 200 feet or so down into the water and back up. So they can bring the barometric pressure, the temperature, the water temperature in different depths of water, and they kind of just move around going up and down. So they're perfect. And some really creative thinking, and there are less and less turtles as the world encroaches on their nesting grounds. And so it's so crucial for them not to be hunted for food, for them not to be killed because they are seen as a predator, and for them to be protected. So it's more incentive for those turtles in that area also to get more protection. So it's kind of a win-win for the turtles too. Being used for a little bit will help them and their survival overall. So I hope you think that story is interesting. I've got a link for my members, of course. It's only $1.99 to be a member, and you get an episode of Fishtory. Pretty much every day of the week you'll have an episode of content coming out from me. 4 episodes of Fishtory a week, and you've got my normal episodes and 2 live streams. If you're on the Aquatic Morning Show watching this, thank you so much for joining us here too, and I'm going to hand it over back to Jess. Thanks, guys. Bye. Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Alex Williamson, and we're here with episode 103 of Fishtory. And thank you so much for supporting the channel, supporting the Aquatic Morning Show, and supporting just educating yourself and learning something new each day. So for today's episode, we have another story that Patrick sent me, and I happened to stumble upon it later too, and so I've seen a few different iterations of it, and maybe some of you have too. And it touches on a story that we covered earlier in an episode of Fishtory that talked about how fish keepers are keeping goodyids. There's several different working groups, but there's the goodyiad working group that keeps goodyids, which are a live bear that lives in Central America, Mexico, and other regions in the far north of South America and the far south of North America. Okay, just Central America. I don't know why I said all that. But a really endangered goodyiad for a long time was the Skiffia Francesa, and it was a goodyead that existed in this one particular area, and now all they had was half breeds left of it, or hybrids, I should say, of it. And so what they did is they got together, they bred back full breeds with new DNA so they wouldn't all be inbred and whatnot from captive bred collections, mostly in Europe. Mostly it was European fish keepers, but also a few Americans. And they kept all these different lines literally since the 1970s, some of them, and they collected these fish and they have kept them alive even though their territory where they live got destroyed, got mangled by pollution and habitat destruction. And now it's been kind of restored. And so they were looking at that area and saying, is it time? Can we bring back these fish that have been gone for the most part since the 70s? And they are doing the first part of the research that basically tells them yes or no. And there was kind of a 5-part study that they broke down. And what's neat is they've already done this with the tequila goodyead. So the tequila split fin, which is a goodyead that I have in my care as well, it is one from the region where the drink tequila is from. And it was thought to be extinct in the wild too, and it's one that they were able to reintroduce to habitat that had been restored and kind of rejuvenated, basically. And this current one that they're talking about reintroducing, they wanted to see what factors would determine whether it could stay or not. And so they worked out some little sample groups and they did a trial for a year, basically, trying to figure out what it was that would tell them these will be a success if we reintroduce them, or is this a waste of time if we reintroduce them? And the study came back with basically a process of how to study whether or not it was time to reintroduce at least live bears to a habitat. Now, fish that lay eggs, it might be a little different. They have different life cycles and different return on the fry. In some ways, they have way more babies and they have a better chance at survival. In other ways, the eggs might not hatch and they could all be getting destroyed. There could be something like DDT or, some pesticide, for example, that's causing problems with the eggs themselves, like we found with eagles. And in that case, then there's no hope, for those fish in that water. But in these waters, these live bears, they develop the babies in their stomach, obviously. And so they have their internal for lack of a better word, womb, and then they give birth to the babies and they're good to go. And so a lot of them can survive. So the real problem was to see, one, is there enough habitat for them? Two, are there predators that are going to just eat them right out of the gates that have kind of come and filled in the niche that they used to hold? Or is it going to be okay? Do they have some niche in their original habitat that is still waiting to be filled, and is there still food for them? And so they decided that they could start reintroducing them, and pretty exciting stuff. So the Scyphia francesa or francisia, I don't know if it's a ch or a s sound that the C makes, honestly. I haven't heard anyone say it out loud, but they're going to be adding another successful goodyead reintroduction to the list. So this is just another reason why the CARES program and some of the other incredible programs where we keep endangered or even extinct in the wild species and try to undo hybridization or try to work backwards from hybridization, that's all that's left of a species in the wild, and end up with a normal or pure original type strain of fish, why it's so important and why those genetics that fish keepers have in their care, especially those of us who keep fish for decades on end and so forth, why it's so important and so crucial that we keep our lines organized and know what's in them, what they are, and not interbreed them if they're these species that are under so much threat. So it's really encouraging work, and it's really encouraging for all of the other people that are involved, like the Goodyear Working Group and the CARES organization, or maybe BAP, depending on what your local club calls it or gets involved with. But it's just awesome to see that fish keepers and hobbyists, not universities or anything like that necessarily, are the main factor in holding these lines and then reintroducing them with the help of the university's research and work and organization. But that we make a difference as hobbyists. You don't need a degree, you just need a fish tank and a heart. So I think that's a really good message for this Tuesday, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks again. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I hope your week is going well. We have episode 104 of Fishtory, and today we've got another interesting episode where we're going to be talking about an entire biome ecosystem that it gets overlooked. It's not really kept in captivity very often, and that's something that we could change. Probably a lot of you down on the Gulf Coast could help change this, but what this has to do with, this article and this news that's recently come out, is that the mangrove groves of the world, whether they're on South American rainforest margins or they're in Thailand and Indonesia, the Philippines, wherever they may be in the world, mangroves, Africa, they occur all over the equatorial world. And mangroves are the second biggest factor or band in the ecosystem when you look at all the different areas, from tundra to alpine to rainforest to temperate forest to deserts. They are the second biggest carbon and greenhouse gas holder and basically sink or storage that there is. So, I mean, they're up there right with the rainforests and the peat bogs in old growth rainforests, which are usually just inland from them. And they're bigger than, for instance, all of the Canadian and Russian woodlands. It's insane. So they store a ton of carbon. And you may wonder, well, where's all this carbon coming from? You know, is it CO2? What is it? And yes, it is CO2 from the oxygen, but it's also woody debris that gets washed up during storms and floats in the water, and dead debris, decaying debris that normally on land, it breaks down, it decays, and it turns into peat or it turns into soil, but that does put off greenhouse gases and so forth. And, you know, even just because it's natural doesn't mean it's not adding to climate change. And at the same time, these awesome spots of mangroves around the world that play such a vital role in the health of our planet, they're under threat because of climate change. So these are something we need to definitely protect, because they're also nurseries for baby fish, and they're also food sources, and they encourage all sorts of bacteria and fungi and insects and little crustaceans and copepods and all sorts of stuff that only live there and that need those mangroves to survive. So these coastal forests are the second most carbon-rich ecosystem in the world, and they are able to store 1,000 tons of carbon per hectare, which is the size of a football field or a football pitch. And they do this by capturing carbon from the air and storing it in their leaves and branches. And we knew that. But there's an additional, say 30% or so, that they're also taking from that floating wood and that debris and that decaying stuff, and they work it into the ecosystem that is the shoreline. And so the University of Portsmouth has been doing some research, and they've revealed just how much carbon is being stored in this large woody debris that builds up and creates these forests. And they said that this is a new aspect of where carbon is being stored that nobody put enough thought into in the past. thinking that it would add up to a difference, and it does. It's the second biggest location where carbon is being stored, is, all the wood floating around the oceans and all the stuff and the animals that come in and that die and then wash into the beach. Well, these mangroves have evolved to handle that. They have the life forms to handle it. They have the scavengers and things that handle it. And they're just really crucial. When they're not there, it just piles up and a lot of it just rots. And when bacteria deals with it, it goes back up into the air oftentimes because it just off gases. So it's just kind of interesting, the new research that they're doing, and they're finding that climate change is not only damaging these environments, but it's causing animals like clams and oysters and things like that once were abundant on the trees themselves and on the reefs and things that those roots help create, and the land that they help create, because they trap sand and debris and, like I said, wood and all sorts of other stuff that then gets turned into atolls and turned into shoreline, and that helps lessen the impact of hurricanes and things. It helps break waves. And so they've said that, it's a double loss now, they're realizing, when they lose these, because all those shellfish that live in those areas also, they are dying. And when they die and those reefs die, it gets melted down by the mild acidity in the ocean, and then causes the ocean to get even more acidic. And over time, it's just really bad to have that carbon breaking down. So the calcium and carbon over time break down, and after you've got the carbonic acid and the nitric acid and the humic acid and stuff that occurs in the short term, after you get that acidic spike, it actually speeds up the process, because the oceans are becoming more acidic. And then those, usually you'd think shells would help buffer, but the carbon from those shells is actually turning into acid over the long term as it gets broken up and smashed in on the rocks where these mangroves once were, where they once caused sandy shores and wood covered and moss and peat and all sorts of other stuff covered shorelines. Now it's just crashing against rocky shores, basically, or dead trees. And the other problem is that the water's rising. So obviously the mangroves can slowly grow back with the water rising, but they can't grow at the rate that the water is rising right now. So we're going to lose these mangroves, and it's really important that we start trying to mitigate some of this, and that maybe we even replant mangroves, and that we try to slow the climate change, because most of the world, the ocean is getting higher and higher, and in 100 years you can have a well-established mangrove collection and ecology started, but you got to give it the time and space to develop. If you put houses there, or if you clear it for shipping channels or whatever it may be, they're not going to take hold. They're not going to have that baseline to build up from the shallows, and they can't just keep reaching back up shore. The mangroves aren't going to just recede with the water. It happens too quickly for them. They need something like double or triple that time. And that's the bummer part about this study, is that they found that the mangroves, yes, a mangrove tree singularly can grow fast enough, but the mangrove old growth and the twisted labyrinth that is a mangrove swamp and forest, same with cypress trees, they're not going to move back quick enough to keep up with the pace of the water rising at the current rate we're seeing. So we need to, one, work on that, and two, think of how much this can save. So if it does get warmer in other areas and we can plant mangrove in areas where it wasn't once possible, the other thing this study highlights is that we could start trying to encourage mangrove swamps and things ahead of when nature decides that they can spread. And that can be a good storage place and mitigation of these climate effects, and maybe help slow it down a little bit. Now, we're going to need every little piece from every corner of the world to do this, and it's all kind of hopeless if humans don't want to help, period. So it's one of those situations where it's a great thought and it's a great study, but it's kind of like, is it trying to, plug up a bullet wound with a Band-Aid? I don't know, but maybe it's hope for the future. Maybe we can make, ridge lines or islands of these mangroves somewhere, and get ready for when the sea level is a foot or two higher, and they'll be ready and help mitigate that process. Who knows? We need creative solutions, we need creative minds, and we need to look to nature. So that's kind of the mixed bag of an episode, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless that it's the second biggest store of carbon, and that 1,000 tons of carbon, pure elemental carbon, is in one football field of mangrove trees. That's insane. And the shells and things that are in the shallow water that they usually include. So pretty amazing, and also pretty bad when they get destroyed and that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere quicker than it should be. All right, guys, that was a long one. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye. Hey guys, how's it going? It's Alex Williamson here with Fishtory, episode 105. 105 episodes. Thank you so much for making that possible, and for supporting the channel and supporting all of us here in the FishTube community and the Aquatic Morning Show. Creators like me, thank you. So today our episode is going to be about evolution. Never talked about that before on this show. So we are talking about the evolution of jaws. So if you lived 500 million years ago, you could swim in the oceans and not worry about a single thing. There was nothing to worry about because nothing had jaws to eat you. Well, then right around 480 million years ago, something changed, and we start seeing creatures with jaws. We start seeing creatures with real big mouths, and within a few million years, like 20 million years, there's giant creatures in the ocean that can eat giant things. And it's because of jaws. Before that, basically, we had kind of snake-like creatures, and swimming creatures that could open a mouth, and even snakes have jaws, but I mean, they had something like a snake mouth where they worked their way up what they were eating, as many little microbes and other creatures do. But the jaw for a long time was a mystery. How did it evolve? And now there was a theory that was created in the 1880s by a couple evolutionary biologists when that was a brand new field, and they said, well, looks like jaws were created when the gills of fish are being created, because the gills have this structure in the embryonic stages of some fish, and they knew that depending on how many gill operculum flaps there were, that some of them would come forward, and that could make a jaw, or even some of the creepy crawly animals that have a jaw within a jaw that are in the bottom of the sea. They're kind of looking at some of those things and seeing how they're able to do that, and it looked like that it was almost like an extra gill that was their first jaw, and then that little mouth that they have, or proboscis within there, is then the other jaw. And they're looking at insects, they're looking at all sorts of things, and it was one biology professor, a naturalist, whatever you want to call him at the time, that said, I think the key is in fish specifically. And they tried to look at fish, and it was no use. They couldn't get fish from embryos that were formed enough where they could tell what was going on. But they did get some fish, such as the zebra danio, or zebrafish at the time as it was known. By the early turn of the century, they had documented by staining the embryos. They could see step by step, they would dissect these embryos and show that it looked like the gill was becoming one of the gill arches, or pharyngeal arches that they have when they're an embryo. Moves from just being part of the throat and mouth area it opens, organs kind of come in, and blood flow comes in, spinal cord sends nerves through there and all that, and it specializes that tissue. Well, then the other tissue seems to come forward. And they had that theory, they worked on it a little bit, and they could only go so far by using, modest microscopes and dyeing slides of zebrafish. So scientists have gone back in using the same exact fish because, why not? And they have taken the zebrafish and looked at it under the microscope, as well as MRI imaging. That's that new high-tech creepy imaging. Well, some people think it's adorable. I think it's kind of creepy, where they show babies and you can see like every little detail of a really young fetus or an elephant fetus or whatever it is you're looking at. It's high def 3D. They can even like transpose color and shading onto it and stuff with different applications. But what they were able to do with this is identify certain tissues by also taking cell cultures with a very small needle and then looking at the DNA of those cells and seeing what enzymes were being triggered. And they could see that the gills and the jaw, before they're formed on the very first stages of the embryonic fish, that they had some of the same signals. And then they were able to see a few differences in those hormonal and enzyme signals. I don't know enough about this to differentiate what type of enzymes they were or anything like that. But maybe some of you biologists out there are, and can help fill us in the comments. But basically then they were able to say that some of them were coming forward and forming cartilage or bone, and some of them were staying back and staying as gills, and then organs were forming up with them, and they were seeing the organ tissue. So they have actually documented it on a genetic basis and on the physical basis of imaging, of MRI imaging on these teeny tiny little embryos. If you've ever seen like a rice fish or a zebra fish egg, they're teeny tiny. And they're able to image these like a few hours after they're fertilized and then track them from there out, which is just incredible technology. So because of this, the old question of, how did jaws form, which allowed animals to get big, basically. I mean, that is one of the things, other than oxygen in the atmosphere, that allowed insects to get big and creepy crawlies to get big. But jaws are what really allowed things to start eating large amounts of calories, becoming predators and things like that. And this is an answer to that question that we've been looking for a long time. And for now, it looks like we've kind of solved it. And we've even found some fossils that line up with this hypothesis that was a common ancestor between skates and rays and sharks or cartilaginous fish and bony fish. And so we know it was something in the water also. And they also looked at rays and, stingrays and manta rays and things like that. And they found that their mouth, the way it formed, was identical with the enzymes and the different genes. They were different, a different formation, but it was still from that same proto-gill organ that was evolved in the embryo. That's where they developed it also. And they were able to look at sharks and rays and the cartilaginous fish that branched off from all the other fish. And that told them that they both had the same mechanism in a shared ancestor way back. So we know that this evolutionary technique or adaptation feature goes back before they even split off. So then the question is, how far does it go back? Is it completely before lampreys and other fish broke off? And that's the work they're doing now. So we'll have to see if those round mouths with 1,000 teeth in them to hold on to things, if those evolve the same way or if they're earlier. Coelacanths, it's another question, but they seem to have jaws. So did they evolve the same way or were they earlier? And that's what they're trying to pinpoint right now, is when did this happen exactly? They've traced when it didn't happen, how recently it didn't happen, and it was already occurring, but they don't know just how far back it did happen. So I hope that's interesting to you guys. I thought it was fascinating. And all the links are going to be in on my channel for members, also in the community tab. So if you have any more thoughts or questions or want to source any of these things for projects and whatnot, self-research, they're all there for you. So thanks again for your time. I hope you guys all have a great weekend, and I'll give it back to you, Jess. Take care, everyone. Bye.